Noch nicht, ne? Jetzt. Okay. So could I ask everyone to find a seat? And we will kick off this food security town hall. Welcome to the 2022 Munich Security Conference. On behalf of Wolfgang Ischinger and all of us at MSC, we're delighted to be here with you, real people in a room talking to each other. That's what this is all about. My name is Boris Ruger, and I'm Vice Chair of the Munich Security Conference. We have great speakers and a great audience tonight. MSC 2 years ago put food security on the agenda, and we had a town hall here in Munich. Some believe that this conference is about hard security, tanks, planes, ships, missiles, maybe toss in cyber. But like many, we have come to appreciate that security is something that needs to be understood in a much more comprehensive way. And the connection between food security on the one hand and conflict, political instability on the other hand, is becoming more and more obvious, and I think we're going to get into that. 2 years ago, David Beasley, Executive Director of WFP, was one of our speakers. And later that year, WFP received the Nobel Peace Prize. Well deserved, if I may say so. So perhaps we can start with a round of applause for the World Food Programme, its people, and its Executive Director. I would also like to welcome Ambassador Cindy McCain, Permanent Representative of the US to the UN agencies in Rome, which of course include WFP and FAO. This is not your first time at MSC, I believe, no. Ambassador. We have a soft spot for people called McCain.
Oh, I know. I know. Thank you.
And we're delighted to have you back.
Thank you.
Please give a hand to Cindy McCain.
Thank you.
David, let's go straight at it. What's the difference between 2020 and 2022 when it comes to food emergencies and food security and your job?
Boris, when I joined the World Food Program 5 years ago, there were 80 million people marching toward starvation. They didn't know where the next meal was coming from. My goal was to put the World Food Program out of business, thinking that we were on such a good trajectory, and then we started seeing things go the other direction. So from 5 years ago to 2 years ago, the number jumped from 80 million to 135 million. The first question would be, well, why? Man-made conflict, climate change. Then, right before COVID, sitting at 135 million marching toward starvation, the number then spiked from 135 to now 285 million people marching toward starvation. And out of that, there are 45 million knocking on famine's door in 43 countries. We averted famine and catastrophe in 2021 and 2022 because nations of the world stepped up. But we thought that COVID would be behind us by 2022. But it only recycled again, only exacerbating and created economic catastrophe among particularly the poorest countries around the world. So these are the countries that are struggling in such a way that if we do not address immediately over the next 9 months, we will see famine, we will see destabilization of nations like you are already seeing in certain places like in the Sahel, and third, you'll see mass migration. And I can tell you from experience, we've got the solutions, we've got the programs, we need the money and the follow-through. Otherwise, nations around the world will pay for it 1,000-fold. And so as we would say, we have like a ring of fire circling the earth right now, from the Sahel, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, then you get over to Yemen, and then the Middle East with regards to Syria and Lebanon, and then Afghanistan. You keep going and you come around to the Central American countries and Haiti, and it's a ring of fire that we're facing right now. And if we don't do something, we're going to pay a mighty big price, as we've seen in the past few years. Let me just give you an example. Germany, when Syria hit, we didn't respond in time. And Germany just did a study that showcased a Syrian who does not want to leave Syria, and we feed 125 million people. We know what people are thinking. We survey them all the time. And if I fed everybody in Munich every day for 2-3 years, we know what the people in Munich are thinking. So we see trends and patterns, and people don't want to leave home, but if they don't have food and any degree of security for their families, they will do what any parent, mom and dad would do. They will flee to find it. We can feed a Syrian, for example, in Syria for 50 cents. That's a war area, so it's a little more expensive. That same Syrian ends up in, let's say, Munich or Berlin. The cost is over 70 euros per day. And guess what? That refugee actually wants to be home. So if we can get out in advance, particularly with the programs that we have that we'll talk about on how we deal with climate change and what we can do in these hostile environments where the Sahel is moving down by the year because of climate impact, then you get extremist groups. Where I've been the last 3 days, I've been in Ethiopia, Chad, Niger, and Benin, watching the extremist groups exploit climate change and fragile governance, and it's creating dynamic destruction. So this ring of fire has got to be dealt with. And it seems like we're so rightfully, to a certain degree, consumed with Afghanistan and Ukraine, but I need to awaken the world to what's facing us around the world at this time. So, Boris, it's great to be with you, to enlighten the people of the reality that we're facing at a time like this.
Could you just repeat that number, the 285 million?
285 million people, as we would say, are marching towards starvation. That's not chronic hunger. That's 810 million. That's a different type of food insecurity. These are people who don't know where their next meal is coming from. And let me give you an example, like in Burkina Faso. You just saw political instability in Burkina Faso. Well, we have been telling world leaders for the past 4 years that the Sahel is deteriorating and there's going to be political repercussions. The number of people marching to starvation in Burkina Faso has gone up almost 10 times. In that Sahel region, it's gone from 3.5 million to 10.6 million. The number of people displaced in Burkina Faso alone, displacement, has gone from 141,000 to 1.5 million in just 2 years. So what do you think happens in a community where 1 million people become displaced? It becomes political disruption and destabilization, and then you end up with war and conflict, and the price tag is 1,000 times more expensive, as you can only imagine. And we've got simple solutions, not just feeding people. I saw a program that we had in Niger just the other day in Chad. We were feeding a village, about 300 people. And we feed millions of people in this region. But this one village, 300 people, you're talking about at 50 cents a day, that's about $50,000 a year, give or take. $50,000 a year, times 20 is a lot of money. We can come in there with $10,000 to $15,000 worth of water wells and water systems one time. I've seen it firsthand. We've got to be smarter about how we spend our money, be strategic, because I have not met a beneficiary yet that wanted outside help. They want to take care of their own families, and we've got the solutions. It's wonderful to see so many great friends in here who understand we need to approach things differently than we did before.
Thanks, David. Cindy, you've been ambassador at the FAO, WFP, other organizations for a few months now. You've been looking at these issues for a long time. How is, from that vantage point of being the U.S. representative with these UN organizations, was there anything that surprised you? Was the reality sort of different from what you had seen as an outsider?
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be on the same stage with David. He's always been someone I've always looked up to on these issues. We worked together for a while, and I have learned a great deal from him through the years. So in many ways, he was a teacher of mine as well, along with Earthrun in the room, too. I worked with her for a long time. I think the surprising thing for me was exactly what David was alluding to, and that is the lack of nimble ability to solve these problems. We have, we have a cumbersome system. When we talk of the UN, we have a cumbersome system, and when we really need to be fast and nimble, because these are fast-moving problems. And so for David to be able to do his work and for other organizations to be able to do their work, we need to work in a timely fashion. We also need to work in a fashion that is not just nimble, but that can morph into something else at a moment's notice. You know, 5 years ago, David didn't think he was going to be building wells or anything else, but that's what this has evolved into. It's what's necessary. And so I think the thing to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about climate change and water issues around the world, is just that. We have to keep our options open on all of this to be able to not only alleviate hunger, but to help solve water issues, to be able to solve human rights issues, because this is a bundle of human rights problems in the long run. And so I guess if I had one wish, I would say I'd like not to have to drag a wet sandbag and be able to run instead.
Absolutely. So Afghanistan is one of those emergency situations, and we're going to have a town hall on Afghanistan tomorrow. Yemen is another one, and your colleagues from WFP kindly supplied us with a short video clip, and maybe colleagues can play that for us. Let's see whether this works.
WFP food assistance is a vital lifeline to many, many Yemenis, without which the hunger rates would have been much higher. And until there's peace and a more functional economy, food assistance will remain the only way to prevent a slide towards disaster. But WFP can deliver. In 2021 alone, with the support of our donors, WFP delivered 1 million tons of food and $130 million in cash assistance to millions of families across Yemen. But our work is becoming more challenging in light of the increasing needs and the funding situation. With this funding situation, WFP is forced to prioritize assistance for the 8 million beneficiaries across the country. And this is coming in a critical situation when the conflict has been escalating and the economy has been crumbling. So for these 8 million beneficiaries who are receiving reduced assistance, it means that they're receiving barely half of the daily minimum food basket that WFP usually supports. And this crunching means that WFP is being forced to prioritize taking the food assistance from those that are hungry to those that are in danger of starving.
That was Amy Nagamuna, WFP Program Officer in Yemen. So do you want to put that in context a little bit for us, David?
You know, just when you think it can't get any worse, it gets worse. And this is the problem with Afghanistan coming online now, a nation of 41, 42 million people. 23 million people are marching towards starvation. And so just to reach those people is $220 million per month. So where am I going to get that money from? Am I going to take it from the children of Ethiopia, from Yemen, from the Sahel? So facing Yemen now, a nation of about 30 million people, 15 million right now, and actually we're coming in out of the field in the next couple of weeks, and the number could really rise up to about 19 to 20 million people we project could be in IPC 3, 4, 5, meaning they're marching towards starvation, they're in trouble. The dilemma we're facing right now, we're feeding 13 million people, but as of the last few weeks, we've had to cut 8 million down to half rations. Those 8 million that are getting half rations will get no food in just a few weeks because we're completely out of money. The 5 million that are in IPC level 4, meaning they are at famine's door, their rations will be cut to half. I don't know how you will not have a living hell on earth in Yemen in the next few months. It is truly catastrophic and a very complex environment to work in.
Thanks, David. I've been to Yemen a few times, Cindy, and when I think Yemen, I think water, or lack of water, rather. Mm-hmm. That's something you're interested in as well.
Yeah, you know, I was born and raised in Arizona, and it's a harsh desert within the United States, as most of you know. And so water was always, as a little kid, was taught you don't waste water, you count every drop, you don't water lawns, you don't have lawns, I mean, all those kinds of things. So when I see certain areas either waste water or not manage their water or not, and of course are affected by climate change and everything else, we have a serious problem. So one of the things that I want to look into is to be able to bring in people that with science, technology, outside the box thinkers, people that can invent, that can do things, to be able to not only desalinize in a personal way for a personal farm, but also be able to use our solar, our wind, our shore wind, everything, to be able to find more water. But with that said, we are up against the biggest hazard of all, and of course that's climate change. And so irrigation is not going to be an option much longer for anybody. We're going to have to figure out better ways, better plants, better processes, better ability to be able to provide less water and produce more food. And so that's, I mean, I know most of you who are involved in this understand that issue, but this is something that really keeps me up at night, is water. And so I hope to at least be a little help in this area.
Excellent. Funding. You and Elon Musk had a little Twitter duel, if I can call it that. And Elon Musk sort of raised the issue of, if I gave you X amount of money, what would you be able to spend it wisely, and so on. So there's a funding issue here, right? So you have a shortfall in funding. Your funding is mostly from governments, and it's the US government, number one, the German government, number two, is your funder, I believe. But it apparently doesn't add up to address the situations, those short-term situations that we're talking about here. So can we expect the private sector to come in and to do more? Is that something we should expect? Is that something you believe will develop?
I don't think you will ever solve poverty and hunger without the private sector being front and center. And I'm not saying that the private sector needs to be the sole funder for charity and philanthropy. Not at all. Not at all. But we're facing a one-time crisis right now. And during COVID, there was an unprecedented amount of wealth accumulated. The billionaires were making over $5.2 billion net worth increase per day, and we need about $6 billion extra monies because of this crisis. And so only thing we were saying is, look, we have a one-time crisis, a perfect storm. How about give us one day's worth of your net worth increase to help the world that's on fire? That was the simplicity. I'm not against people making money, but governments have been tapped out over the past few years, and so I was asking the private sector, like Elon and others, to step up in a time such as this. But I would like for that to be a one-time ask, because having been a United States governor, I do believe, and I've seen firsthand, what happens when you empower people. Mm-hmm. And what I need the private sector to do is walk alongside us and take the lead in addressing hunger and poverty. This is one of the things that we're working on now. It's one thing for the private sector to come in and say, hey, we'll give you money. Number two, we'll engage with you so you can be more strategic, more effective with your programs, your supply chain. But third, and this is the most important, and I know the United States and Germany and many others in this room understand this, we have got to incentivize the private sector to help take ownership of ending hunger and poverty around the world, because they've developed phones, they've got rockets in space now, and so many amazing things. If we could get the mind of an Elon Musk working with us to end hunger, I have little doubt that we can do it. And we're a world now with about 7.8 billion people, and we're struggling now with 810 million people going to bed chronically hungry. On top of that, severe, acute food insecurity. Imagine 2050 when we got 10 billion people and there's not enough to eat in Chicago or Paris or Munich. What do you think is going to happen? So as Cindy McCain was saying, and she's been out in the field about hunger even before I was on these issues, but she's a champion and she clearly gets it and understands what we must do, and that's the teamwork that's needed right now, all of us coming together, because the UN, in my opinion, shunned the private sector for quite some time. But I see a whole new spirit realizing that we're not going to solve the problems of hunger and poverty unless and except we're all in it together.
So we're going to look at some of those medium and long-term solutions, and obviously innovation has to be a big part of that. But what would you say, Cindy, as a U.S. government official, U.S. government being the #1 funder for WFP, what do you expect from the private sector?
More.
Okay.
As David said, it is time. We can no longer rely on any government to fund these programs. This is not just about governments. This is about people to people. I mean, this is survival. And so unless we work together with our private sector, encourage private sectors in whatever way, maybe it's tax breaks, whatever it may be, to get involved, but it's time to get involved. It's time for us to go and say to people and companies and corporations and foundations, et cetera, we need you. We need, not only do we need you, we demand you. Because this issue is too large. David can't do this alone. And so we need, from every walk of life, we need involved. Like I said, our science and technology folks, step up, come on. I know there's people smarter than us out there to figure this out in terms of, science, technology, et cetera. But we have to. It's our duty as people that work on this issue to ask for help outside the government box.
Excellent. I'm looking to the audience because we have a few more minutes before we transition to the next segment. David, did you want to add something?
Yeah, we were talking about water and we're talking about climate change and conflict. 80% of our operations are in conflict areas. I mean, it's a massive operation that we have out there. We're the world's largest, but we're also the world's largest program management on reclaiming land. Right. People don't realize this, and Cindy was talking about this, water, 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 water. Like you go to the Sahel, and you've got farmers and herders that fighting. And then you get on top of that, extremist groups exploit. And so I was just in Niger and Chad, out in these dry, desolate, desert-type areas. And when we come in with rehabilitation of land-type programs, and let me give you an idea. At the World Food Program, over the past few years, we have rehabilitated, we meaning the beneficiaries, over 3 million acres of land. When we come into an area with the beneficiaries, rehabilitate the land so that it can capture the limited water that there is, and then we complement that with a school meals program, holy mackerel. Migration drops, teen pregnancy drops, marriage rate of 12 and 13-year-olds drops, recruitment by ISIS and Al-Qaeda drops. And let me give you this astounding number. This is just Niger alone, and we're documenting these numbers now. They're not finalized. Okay. But, for example, every country has the carbon sequestration they want to do, goals by 2030. The amount of land that our beneficiaries have rehabilitated in the past few years, 190,000 hectares. 190,000 hectares that have been drawing 6 metric tons of carbon out of the air per hectare per year. Do the math. Niger alone will have met between 60 and 70% of their goal just by World Food Programs greening up the planet again. So it's quite amazing. The programs that we have, the people who are paying the biggest price for climate change are the ones that are doing the most to green it back up. And this is what we want the donors to come in, because it's a win-win. We can have water projects, greening up the planet, and that creates resilience and sustainability for women and men in very fragile areas who no longer need our outside support. Because my goal is to put the World Food Program out of business.
Excellent.
Because people won't need us anymore.
Super. I'm looking to the audience. Is there one? I think we have time for one question, one comment, if there's anyone. No? Minister, would you like to, could you say something on the counterterrorism aspect that David Beasley touched on? Minister of Defense of Tanzania, Minister Tax. Do we have a handheld microphone somewhere? Good. Super.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's on.
Thank you very much. Not necessarily on counterterrorism, but I would just have to bring in a different dimension on...
I think you can take your mask off for a second, Minister.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely.
I'm saying not necessarily on counterterrorism, but a different dimension which relates to peace and security. because food security and food security and peace are inseparable. But also, what we have noted is that food insecurity is among the major threats when it comes to peace security. And I'll just like to proceed with the example which was given by FAO. We saw that during COVID-19, during the lockdowns, a number of people faced scarcity of food, and the crimes increased, gender-based violence increased, and we did a research which the correlation was directly. It was not about the lockdown, but it was because of lack of food. And then you can see that now when you have crimes are increasing, gender-based violence are increasing, that result to as well political instability. And we thank FAO because I'm now giving an example when I was still with SADC. We worked with FAO and they tried to address that as quickly as possible. But there was a very clear indication that if we had not taken quick measures, that was going to result into instability, conflicts among countries, because now countries started arguing, you have food, why don't we share? And the country's food, we are saying, no, I have also a problem, I'm keeping this food for my own people. So there's that direct correlation between food insecurity, food security, but also with political stability and the peace and security. So the terrorism is related to that, but I just wanted to bring that big dimension when it comes to food and security. But also, you may have food, because there are a number of dimensions. If you don't have peace, you may have food, but you cannot access food. Mm-hmm. If you have food, but you don't have peace, you can have food, but you cannot utilize food. So all those now turns into instability and insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And I would point out that you're the Minister of Defense, but you have a long background in development economics. You were the Secretary General of SADC for 8 years. So you cover really both of those dimensions. David?
And Cindy knows this well, but I remember General Mattis, General McMaster, and many, I think it was 100 and something generals and military leaders said in a letter to the president, said, if you want to buy more bullets and bombs, cut the World Food Program. Mm-hmm. Because food security is directly related to political unrest and conflict. And that's why the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to the World Food Program, because it's work, laying their lives on the line every day to bring stability, using food as a weapon of peace, not as a weapon of war.
Thank you, David. Cindy, anything to add?
I am just grateful that this panel is taking place, that Munich now, this conference, realized that this is a major part of national security, and I hope we do it more. I really do, because this is an area that I actually told my husband to do a few years ago. So I'm glad you guys listened. So thank you, and I'm grateful for all your participation.
Thank you very much for both of you for being here. Thank you, David. You're free to leave if you like. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you so much. Now, I think we're going to put up some other images, if colleagues could roll those images. And these images are from a company called Planet, and the CEO of that company is Will Marshall, and he's here. And once we have those pictures up, he's going to tell us what they're about. Will.
Thanks very much. Well, we've heard a little bit about the need for technology and innovation, and you might think space, what the heck's that got to do with food security? Well, it actually turns out a lot. And I'm so glad we're here talking about food security, because agriculture is actually a cornerstone issue to so many of the world's problems. Obviously, feeding the planet, but also climate and solving that, as well as peace and security. And so these are images of fields just during their normally crop-growing season. So at Planet, we have 200 satellites that image the entire Earth's landmass once per day, including every farmer's field around the planet. And it's not just pretty pictures. We can tell crop type and crop yield in every 3 by 3 meter box that can help farmers improve and do precision agriculture. That can improve crop yields by 20 to 40%. And importantly, I think it can play a role in food security, not just through making the land more efficient and effectively used, but in 2 key ways. One is when there's a drought, and we've seen in Syria where drought can lead to crop failure, can lead to a civil war, that can lead to refugee crisis, we can see the earliest signs of that and get ahead of that and help with preventative measures. And the second way satellite data can help in this sort of food security situation is preventative. So we can actually help farmers implement sustainable agricultural practices, which really help preventatively. So, for example, sustainable agriculture is things like using cover crops and low tilling practices, and these can help reduce the effects of extreme weather on agriculture, and therefore withstand, for example, extreme weather events and make it more likely that the crops will survive. So in these two important ways, I think satellite technology can really help this discussion.
Please, have a seat, and we'll have the panel come on stage. Cem, if you would join us, please. Werner Baumann, Mariam.
Hi, my name is Cem.
Lovely, yes. We have to do this as well. This is the health security part, I think. Right. Excellent. This is wonderful. Welcome to all of you. Let me briefly introduce our panel. I'll start with Minister Mariam Al-Muhairi, Minister of Climate and the Environment of the United Arab Emirates, previously Minister for Food Security, and in that capacity, 2 years ago, our guest in the first Food Security Town Hall. So welcome. Werner Baumann, also here 2 years ago, CEO of Bayer. And Cem Özdemir, recently appointed Minister of Agriculture, but a Minister of Agriculture who has an unusual national security angle. Long-standing member of the Bundestag with a profile on foreign and security policy. So welcome to all of you, and welcome once again, Will, and thanks for giving us a short...
Some hope.
Yeah, some hope, exactly, absolutely. In the first part of this town hall, we talked about the emergencies, the short term. And I want to talk about the bigger picture a little bit. And Werner, maybe you can start and make it simple for us. So what is the fundamental problem? If we're not just focused on Yemen and the Afghanistan situation, but what is, if we look at it in global terms, what is the problem and how should we understand it?
So first of all, thanks for being here with the participants of this panel. And when I was born in 1962, I guess, the world was very, very different. There was only about 3 billion people that lived on the planet. And as we've heard from David, it's just about 8 billion people that will be living on the planet at the end of this year. And it's going to be 10 billion of us in about 20 years' time. At the same time, over the last, let's say, 100 plus years, we've been living substantially beyond the capacity of our planet. And we see it front, right, left, and center, that leaves massive problems and imbalances that need to be addressed, which means that there's actually many, many factors that drive that structural instability that is also an element to food insecurity that we have to tackle. When it comes to food insecurity in and by itself, there's a number of drivers that we've seen and we've heard about it already. So crisis is one, a conflict is another one, and climate is a very, very big contributor because we see massive changes in arable land and the lack thereof. We see massive pressure on ecosystems, and with that, and Cindy mentioned that earlier, and David as well, we just need to find better solutions. I mean, you're in the business of finding better solutions, we are as well. And it means that we have to find solutions that give us a more climate resilient type of agriculture, where we bring people who are the ones that are most exposed into the capacity to care for themselves and their family's livelihood with better tools, better knowledge, and also access to finance and a few other things. So if I would look at a few examples that make it a little bit tangible what it means. You could think about the fact that right now people have an awful lot of problems and difficulties accessing fertilizer. Prices are skyrocketing, and it's actually an immediate result of the energy crisis and the energy transformation, which makes energy very expensive, and fertilizer accounts for about 3 to 5% of global primary energy use. Yeah, and then you see that, of course, translate into prices for fertilizer. So there's new science out there and a number of very innovative companies working on finding a way to teach plants to fixate nitrogen out of the air rather than you contributing it with, let's say, artificial fertilizer. So bringing that to people that have then essentially access to better seeds, who know how to do that, the plants, would actually alleviate the problem that they don't have access to fertilizer that is instrumental, yeah, to them growing and then having, let's say, a decent harvest. So that would be just one example. The second one is that we need much more resilience in terms of stress resistance, drought resistance, lodging of corn, which is a big issue, so that you can protect your harvest. And that is the type of innovation that we need, coupled with better access to financing, coupled with better education of farmers, so that they can actually ultimately get out of subsistence or actually famine, as we've heard, and have better livelihoods.
Can I ask a follow-up? I believe last time we spoke, you put some emphasis on small farmers, right?
Yeah.
Can you put some numbers on that? I mean, why are they as important as you said they were?
We happen to be a fairly big company if you look at what we're doing in agriculture. And just to contextualize it a little bit, today with our business in seeds and crop protection and plant health products, we account for about a quarter, yeah, of the worldwide supply. Okay. And while we have very, very large countries with very, very big customers, yeah, be it Ukraine, be it Brazil and Latin America, or the US and Canada, we will not solve any of these problems if we don't get to smallholders. Smallholders, there's about 500 million of them that produce about a third of global food. In developing countries, actually 80% of the food that is being produced by smallholders. So the scale that we can get if we enable smallholders with better products that they can use, better practices, access to finance, and actually also doing it more sustainably is actually the way to solve it. So we have a program that looks at us reaching about 100 million smallholders by the end of the decade. If you look at the smallholders and their families, this is going to be easy, 500 million people that we would reach and get out of subsistence. And as we speak, we have reached about 50 million that we do that with already, with very, very strong proof points on how we improve family economies if we provide them with better tools. Because as David said, nobody wants to be dependent, on, let's say, a donation or some help without being able to sustain himself in the long run. And that's what we are focusing as we speak.
Thanks, Anna. Mariam, next week you're hosting in Dubai, I believe, the Food for Future Summit. Can you explain what that's about?
Sure. And I just want to say thank you as well to be here on this esteemed panel and to see so many familiar faces. I just want to give a little bit of context before going there. So UAE is known as a country that imports most of its food. We're a water-scarce country. We have less than 5% arable land. And when I took to the position of Minister of State for Food Security in 2017, our leadership said to me, Mariam, focus on a plan, focus on technology and innovation, and focus on research and development. So going down that path, we have National Food Security Strategy. We've now really doubled up on investments in R&D because we believe this is also the way to go. We see us a little bit of a trendsetter. We also feel very responsible as global citizens to invest money and look for solutions that work in our environment. I usually say, what do we have? We have the 3 S's, the sun, the sea, the sand. What can we do with those to actually grow food in the desert? This is why we also announced Food Tech Valley a few months ago. And this is, in a way, our Spielplatz or our playground to look for innovations in food systems. Because as we all know, the climate agenda is not just about the transformation of the energy sector, but also the transformation of our food systems. And our food systems are, as Werner said, they're broken. We know that there's a huge gap, but there's also a malnutrition gap as well. I often say we give a lot of focus on producing food and how we produce food, but we must not forget the food system also has what we as individuals eat, the food waste, how we prepare food, the actual transportation of food. There's a whole food supply chain that we have to think about. And so the UAE is really taking great steps. I mean, the UN had the Food System Summit. The UN had the Food System Summit. After that came COP26. At COP26, we announced Aim for Climate with the United States to drive the acceleration of R&D for the next 5 years to look for climate resilient solutions. We are continuing this next week as well. Gulf Food just happened a few days ago. Now when I go back, it will be the Food, Agriculture and Livelihoods Week. And in that, we want to talk about the food system. The Food for Future Summit is happening within that week at Expo 2020. And this is where we want to also get not just the B2B conversation, but having the connection with consumers. Making the consumers understand that they play a huge part in food systems. Each and every one of us have a huge role to play. And I often set challenges for my own team and my own family as well. I said, let's try and not put any edible food in the bin. You have to think about it. You really have to think about what you're doing, because sometimes you're doing it without realizing it. Also, portion size. The UAE went through a huge, I mean, we're 50 years old. We're a very, very young nation, and we've been through so much. We went through years when the UAE was formed of not having much food. Then we went through a huge surge where the logistics became world-class infrastructure. Lots of people came, lots of food came with that, and we lived very much in abundance. And now we see a huge issue with the diseases of food-related issues and things like that happening. Malnutrition on another level, not talking about hunger, but also a form of malnutrition, diabetes, heart disease. This is a huge issue, and it all comes down to how we're eating. And this, I always feel, we need to put more efforts into awareness. A country like the UAE having 200 nationalities living together, everybody wants their own food. It's very important, or it's a little bit more challenging to try and nudge them into better choices because everybody kind of wants tastes from home, flavors from home. But we've been able to, through the years, harness technology and innovation using the 3 S's of what we can actually grow in the desert. And so today, we're actually, we've got strawberries, raspberries, blueberries made in the UAE. We've got salmon made in the UAE. And this is all because we've harnessed innovation and technology. And we still have to work hard to bring down the cost of that so that we can help other countries make it affordable and accessible for them as well. So we're very excited about next week's Food for Future and the conversations we'll have there and what the UAE wants to spearhead as well for the food systems transformation.
Cem, so Minister of Agriculture, but you have a national security heart beating in your breast. If you look at this picture and if you look at food prices being at a, maybe not a historic high, but a 10-year high, something like that. How do you look at that big picture? And we have a G7 presidency right now. We have a role in shaping some of the agenda. I'd just like your thoughts to start with.
Well, let me first thank for the invitation for being here in this excellent panel. I listened carefully to what Ambassador said and what David said, and I think there is no lack of knowledge, there is a lack of implementation. We know all the facts. It's not, that we have to reinvent the wheel. Having said that, I fully agree with what you said, Minister of Defense from Tanzania. You pointed rightly out. First of all, what we need to do is we have to stop the conflicts, because whatever we invest, my government just recently has decided to spend another 20 million euros to fight the hunger crisis on the Cap of Africa. But none of that will be enough if we do not manage to stop the conflicts. And second, you said that we have to secure access for humanitarian assistance. If we don't do that, whatever we spend, it will not arrive where it needs to arrive. So if we talk about hunger, actually we have to talk about poverty and how we can fight poverty and what we can do to fight poverty. You mentioned, Boris, the Twitter discussion, which was fascinating, between David and Elon Musk. Let me briefly add to that. What can billionaires do? Of course, what can they do? I agree, it's great when billionaires feel responsible, when they feel that they have to contribute in the fight against climate crisis, in the fight against poverty, and you name it. But another point that should be raised is they can support good governance. I believe that's crucial. Good governance is the key to the solution of what we discuss here. So please support Democrats. Stay away from authoritarian regimes. And since I mentioned our side, governance, David mentioned Afghanistan. It didn't come out of a sudden. It was a decision of an administration to pull out, without asking the question, what will happen to those people? And since I mentioned the current administration, I want to be fair and balanced. Let me add the previous administration. It was their decision, since Syria was mentioned, to let our friends alone there who defended Western values. And the consequences we could see. There is no such thing as a gap. Gaps will always be filled. And it will be filled by people we don't like and we shouldn't support, and we shouldn't strengthen. So I just want to underline, we can agree and discuss here what should be done on the technical side with innovations, and I fully support we need more innovations. We can discuss about what our countries can contribute, but none of that will ever be enough if we don't address the root causes.
Can I quiz you about food inflation? And is there anything that Germany can do as the G7 chair to address this issue of food inflation? Food prices going through the roof. We've talked about energy and fertilizers and these kinds of things. How, and there's an immediate, I think, connection to security issues, right? And we know that from the Arab Spring to some extent, that food prices going through the roof produces instability, has lots of knock-on effects. Do we have any instruments to address that?
Well, that's a good question. Just Germany is one of the richest countries in the world, so our economic situation compared to many other states in the world is rather good. But still, in the current conflict we have with Russia on the Ukraine crisis, we see how much we depend on Russian gas, for instance. So can we really take our decisions independent, just based on the facts, just based on what is necessary to respond to what Mr. Putin is doing to threaten the Ukraine? Or do we have to take into account what potential reactions to our measures would mean for our companies when we have a shortage of gas, what it means for our public support? Let me be open, since this is on the Friends. What it means for media coverage, and you name it. So I'm talking about a rich country. Now have in mind countries who do not have those means that we have. So how much they are depending on gas and so on, and energy resources, and how much that affects their economies. So what can we do, since that was your question, in the upcoming G7 leadership? One of the main focuses will be the fight against the climate crisis, because I believe this is one of the root challenges, and it will get worse on a daily basis for all effects, whether it's water excess, whether it's, land, whatever you mean. So therefore, this should be crucial. And we can make a difference if the G7 really, in practical terms, agrees that what we have signed in the Paris Accords is what we do, not only what we preach. Everybody can sign an agreement. But the question is, do carbon emissions get a price? That's a challenge. Do we attract the challenge of our economies getting sustainable? And are we willing to take into account the consequences when this is not cheered by everybody, sometimes by some companies, sometimes by some media, whatever. So this is the challenge. Do we take the lead as the G7 in the fight against the climate crisis?
I have a question to Werner Baumann. Ukraine was mentioned by Cem Özdemir, and we're looking at a scenario of war between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is a big grain exporter. Russia is an even more significant grain exporter. How would that play out if we had military conflict or even a blockade of Ukraine?
I think the immediate effects are the ones that everybody would see. If you put embargoes on Ukraine and Russia in order to have some economic penalty, and drive with that better behavior. What people then tend to forget is where some of the products that are being produced and harvested in Ukraine would go. We would not only have a Eurasian crisis, actually would be a lot of people in the Near Middle East that would suffer because they wouldn't have access anymore. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that is, I think, of key importance beyond, of course, good governance, Cem, the other question that we have to have, let's say, better, more resilient systems is for sure also a substantial step up in us funding global institutions that would help us, keeping supply chains going. That would help us having access in a global and distributed world where supply chains just happen to be global. So there is no such thing for, I think, most companies and most economies that would limit their supply chains and their ability to survive, produce, and have a good livelihood at the border of a country. So I think that is a key consideration that we need to focus on, and we will not get there individually as a company. We would not get there individually as countries. So what we need is a substantial step up of our global institutions, which then also means that we have to endorse their mandates and actually support them better.
I picked up something in the Washington Post, I think last week, where they wrote, of the 14 countries that rely on Ukraine imports for more than 10% of wheat consumption, so 10 countries that import a fair amount of wheat from Ukraine, a significant number already face food insecurity, right? So you block by an embargo or by an actual military conflict the export of grain from Ukraine, it has an immediate impact on a number of countries that are already food insecure. And that is the connection between food security, if you like, or food production, and hard security, right? That produces immediate instability and possibly conflict. Will, do you want to come in on that point?
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly, but we saw this very directly in Afghanistan, which you brought up, when the Taliban took over. We were actually helping prior to that with agriculture in rural regions of Afghanistan in substantive ways. And as soon as the Taliban took over, we couldn't provide that imagery anymore, and therefore that benefit didn't get to them. So in a different way, it had an immediate consequence. But if I may, I wanted to come back to something you said, Werner, that just struck me, that we've got hundreds of millions of smallholder farms that if we're going to get out of this, we've going to have to transition to sustainable agriculture practices in the space of less than a decade, which is quick calculus, tens of thousands of farms per day switching to sustainable agricultural practices. This is no minor, the sheer scale of this, right? If done right, I mean, roughly speaking, as a planet, and we think about that as a sort of planetary perspective, we've wiped out half the forests on the Earth, and we've replaced it with lots of agricultural land. Roughly 25% of the land of the Earth is agricultural land. And done right, with sustainable agriculture, we can actually solve a lot of the climate challenge, stop the deforestation, which is being driven by agriculture and consumption, and help with a lot of these peace and security issues indirectly. But it's just a mammoth challenge over a very short period. We've got some tools. As you're saying, it's really limited by politics, and wars dominate, very quickly in this sort of situation. So we have to, get our governance challenges solved first. I don't think it's a technology-led thing, but I think technology can enable the speeding up of that transition and the scaling up of that transition.
Absolutely. Now, we have in the audience somebody who was the predecessor of David Beasley and of Cindy McCain rolled into one, and that's Ertharin Cousin. And I'd like Ertharin to come into this conversation because she's very knowledgeable on all these issues.
Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to participate in the conversation, but I believe you have a panel here that is the ideal panel that we need for a conversation around food systems transformation. You have government, you have private sector, you have innovators, you have financiers, but I sat in a conversation for an hour and a half about climate, where the agricultural transformation was not raised once, not once. Mm-hmm. And if we all agree that climate is a security issue, we have got to stop talking to each other. I see my friend Stefan de Mistura. I can go around this room. This is family in this room right now. We all agree on what is necessary. But we must become part of the broader conversation around climate as an existential challenge to security and the role of food security in addressing climate. Merely addressing energy, we will not achieve the climate goals. Agriculture is impacted by climate, but it is also an emitter. And if we are not addressing those 10,000 smallholder farmers between now and 2030 to touch 500 million, whatever we do on energy won't be enough. And so I appreciate the opportunity to participate, to intervene in this dialogue, and I appreciate all of the comments that have been made here today. But how do we get this level of recognition of the role of agricultural transformation and all of these actors, the parts that you play in that transformation, into the main stage conversation?
Exactly. Good. I was going to ask you that question, Ertharin, but can I ask Mariam? Sure. Mariam, next year, 2023, you're going to be hosting COP28. You're going to be the lead on that. So how are you going to fix that problem?
I've had the pleasure of having lots of conversations with Ertharin, and it started from the first coffee shop meetings that we had in Davos and in LA, and look where we are today. So yes, COP28 next year is going to be an opportunity for us. I mean, we actually have 2 COPs happening in our region, which is really great. I would have liked to see at COP26 more on food systems than what I saw, and I was happy that Aim for C was a huge global initiative that we did announce. So far, we have 37 countries on board, over 80 non-GOs, non-governmental organizations with us, and commitments of $4 billion. And next week, during the Food, Agriculture and Livelihoods Week, we will be having the first ministerial meeting for Aim for C, where we'll be steering as well the innovation sprints of where the money's going to go. And what I want to make sure that people understand, this is not just about high tech, it's also about low tech. I think this is really important. In the UAE, we're also doing a lot of research and development on seeds that are salt tolerant, that are heat tolerant. This is really important that we assist each other. And the UAE is an enabler to help countries that need these kind of, or we need it ourselves, but also for others that are needing this kind of assistance when it comes to what fertilizers to use, what seeds to use, what kind of water irrigation systems to use, etc. So we're really excited about COP28, and I'm sure I'm going to have a huge role in that. We will make sure that food systems do play a huge, or do make a big part of COP28, because as you said, food systems are a problem, but they are also the solution. And this COP is going to be a very unique COP in 2023, because we will be, or it'll be the global stock take. Okay. So we're going to be seeing where we are. From what we can see, we're not going to be on track. So it's really important that from now we're looking at solutions, and solutions are not just on the energy sector, they're on the food sector, they're on the transport sector, they're on the industry sector. There are so many players that we have to take care of. And so we're really looking to build partnerships. It's so important here because we cannot do this alone. And working together with many countries and organizations and putting mechanisms into place. I mean, you were talking about how we can offset carbon, how we can make, or how can the government incentivize markets so that those who are being responsible feel all the kind of money they're putting in actually benefits them at the end of the day. So we need to incentivize the markets that are sustainable, because the government cannot control the markets, but incentivizing makes sense. And what are the mechanisms we need to do to kind of guide that kind of transformation that we need in the sectors? So this is something we're looking forward to, but we've got a lot to do, and we're really looking forward to having everyone that's here in the room. I know you're all here because you care about food systems, you care about the whole subject of food security, and we'll look forward to also working closely with you.
So this food security town hall is actually a climate town hall as well.
Yes.
Vanna, you wanted to react, and then Cem, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. So thanks, Catherine, for kind of letting us know, get your act together and get going, if I translate it into my words. And I can only say for Bayer that we are going to be delivering against our part of the bargain. You pointed out, rightfully so, that without fixing agriculture when it comes to climate protection, we will not get anywhere. Roughly a quarter of all emissions globally are related to the food chain. And we said that by the end of this decade, we will help our customers to reduce their carbon footprint by 30%. Okay. So the only ask I would have, if I look at regulators, governments, is that we need the support of governments and regulators in terms of a pro-innovation and opportunity-oriented regulation that unleashes the power of the innovation that we can actually bring to mankind. When you're in the middle of it, Will, VR, and you're such a great sponsor, Mariam, of actually incentivizing new solutions that we need for the problems that have grown way too big, to solve them with current knowledge and current tools. And that is what we need. And then, I'm absolutely sure that we can get there. And just for full transparency, Catherine is also going to help us limp along, because she happens to be part of our supervisory board and now is also chairing our sustainability council. So she's going to have a keen eye on what we are doing in order for us to make sure that we deliver.
Okay. Cem?
I wanted to jump into that discussion as well. You rightly pointed out what the challenges are. One could sum up it with the 3 Gs, if you want, or the 3 Cs. It's COVID, it's climate, and it's conflict. These are currently the 3 challenges, and I think we need to adjust our responses, therefore, accordingly. It's, first of all, a successful fight against food insecurity that can only be successful. I mentioned that before, if we touch the problems, climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and that addressed in a sustainable way. But let me add some skepticism into the enthusiasm for technical solutions. First of all, industry and I myself, we fund satellite-based systems because I believe that's crucial to help our farmers. But let me jump back to the 70s. When I was going to school, I had teachers telling me about the green revolution. And that's the big thing that will solve all our problems, and then we will live in paradise. There will be no more hunger. Everybody will be happy on the planet. We will live in a just and equal society. And looking from today, I think everybody will agree that's not fully the case, to say the least. So therefore, technical solutions can only base on the previous on the ground condition, and that's, let me repeat that, we have to end conflicts, we have to concentrate on good governance, we have to make sure that people have access to aid, and that's crucial, and there we have our responsibilities. And sometimes I think we take a shortcut or the easy way, and discussing about future solutions that might appear one day, and try to avoid what we can do today.
That's actually not the case. Because a lot of the solutions that we need, they need to be, let's say, they have to have a broader proliferation. It's not that we need an entirely new set of solutions that we just dream about in order to fix some of these problems. We only have 8 years' time. And I think we can get an awful lot done if we get these solutions and tools into the hands of the people that can put them to use. Whether it's digital, I mean, you've shown it, what you're doing is real. We have a huge digital farming unit that can help increase productivity. Going to better farming practice, which means no tillage, which means no actually release of carbon to the atmosphere, is a big thing. Driving for better seeds that can tolerate salt, that can tolerate heat, is something that we can do with high-speed breeding technologies that are there today. Yeah, so it's actually not that we have to wait for the next 15, 20 years for proof of concept. I'd say that, let's say, 80% of the solutions are there, and they just need to be broader distributed, and we have to provide access. And I think that is...
How does that work, Werner? What is stopping them from being deployed, and how do you fix that?
Well, quite frankly, Boris, we cannot do it alone. Yeah, so we need to act in concert. We need to have governments that support an open innovation mind. We have to have partners that help us actually reach farmers who live today in subsistence. And the most difficult thing is to get to the 10,000 a day on the last mile. We are working with the International Finance Corporation, which is a subunit of the World Bank, Netafin, and then 20 other partners to do exactly that. And if I look at the early results, it's actually fascinating that with that level of cooperation and the stuff we have today in our hands, we can bring these people into the position of, after the first year, having double the income of the rural average income that families would have. So we need scale, we need your coalition of the willing, and then we need to get going.
This is not to contradict what you just said, but you know, as I said, I agree that many of the solutions will be found by technology, and we have to invest in research and technology. But many of the solutions are already there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. As I said before, renewable energy is already there. We just have to use it. We have to make it accessible. Alternatives, you know, to the kind of transport methods we're currently using are there already. They're already invented. We just have to make them accessible. Public transport is already there. Or if you look to my field, in agriculture, we already have organic farming. We already have methods, as you know, to reduce pesticides and so on. So we just have to do it and have to make it accessible for the rest of the world.
Will, you wanted to come in.
Yeah,
and I want to encourage everyone in the audience, think about a question or comment if you have one, and then we'll try and bring you in.
Yeah, I want to reconcile this. I mean, I definitely feel both of the sides of this. I mean, I don't think it's mainly a technology solution to get us out of the problem. It's more the human level. But the technology certainly helps. And I think the frustration that we see is that the speed at which it could happen is much faster than it is happening. And why is that? I mean, take the EU with the Common Agricultural Policy. If that would incentivize sustainable agriculture practices through actually how it does the reimbursement to the farmers, that would make a big difference. Right now, there's a bunch of countries in the world, including in the EU, that actually disincentivize that. They will say you can't get crop insurance if you use cover crops, because that's not part of the standard processing, or if you don't use tilling, because that's not part of it. So government can change that regulation and incentivize this adoption. The tools, as you sort of point out, are already there. It's frustrating that not going to scale, especially because we've got to get these tens of thousands of farms per day into sustainable ag to meet our goals. So I think there's a lot of potential untapped right this second, and I think that's what we would say.
Can I ask you, well, sort of when you were explaining the images, and what people imagine when they look at what you do is images, and then you have these overlays and so on. But the analytical part of that, can you describe that in a slightly more detail? Because it's not just images, it is analysis and using all sorts of data.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, it's more than the images. We use the different spectral bands in the satellite image to pull out, basically, chlorophyll sticks out like a sore thumb in near-infrared band, that we can then use to measure biomass, which we can then use to imply crop yield on this sort of 3 by 3 meter basis. And that enables intelligent use of farming practices. So which area of the farm is affected by blight? Does it need water, fertilizer? How do you, and this can increase crop yields by sort of 20 to 40% and decrease fertilizer use, which is also bad for runoff, as well as the reasons that you were saying. By similar sorts of degrees, so it can make it more efficient, which is, of course, super important. But similarly, we can monitor these agricultural practices like cover crops, tilling from space, and therefore do the measurement, verification, and reporting of, say, EU strategy to accelerate the adoption of sustainable agriculture. So I think a lot of the stuff is there, but not fully utilized yet. But it's relatively new, so society's only just coming to grips with these sort of new data sets and AI and analysis that can pull the information out of that data.
Boris, I just want to jump in a little bit. On the technology side. I think what's really important is that, I mean, every country has its own challenges and has its own, like when we think of food security, UAE being a country that is water scarce, that doesn't have the arable land, we see that technology is something that would be a solution for us, because we think of things like, okay, how can we use every drop of water, recirculate that water as much as possible to grow certain foods? And it doesn't make sense to grow everything in the UAE. There's certain things that we say this is an absolute no-go. It uses too much water. But we have found ways, we understand that most of the water used in closed system farms is actually for cooling purposes, more than to irrigate the plant itself. Now we can start thinking of things like treated wastewater. How can we put that into the equation so that less water can be used, but very high quality products can be done? Something I also connect technology with is attracting the youth. I think this is something that our farmers are of a very old generation. That's the case in the UAE. And for me to attract now farmers into growing food, I have to always talk about technology. I ask them, I said, if you love food, you love technology. I don't call them farmers anymore. I give them a new name, agri-technologists. Those who've heard me speak, because we need to make this a cool thing to do. Mm-hmm. And this is how I entice the young people to come into this and actually think of, can I actually take a warehouse now that we have, an old warehouse, or can I use a real estate development project that's not being used now to live in, to actually turn it into a farm? Can I use a building that has the whole cooling system and use that condensed water to be able to use to actually start a closed system farm within a building? So these are the kind of ideas that we're trying to bring. And for sure, in the beginning, you think this is very expensive, But I feel it is an attraction to attract the young people into it. It's an attraction to start looking down to bringing down the cost. And we've seen now a lot of companies that have set up in the UAE 3-4 years ago using some innovation funds and are now going into neighboring countries to help them as technology providers on how to grow food now in our environments. So I think it's Germany is an agriculture, open field country, and that's why I always think everyone looks at it a little bit differently, but I always feel these kind of conversations really help us to think of more of a holistic approach, and I'm always thinking of the youth, the women as well, to attract them into this sector.
Excellent.
Can I add something to that?
Absolutely, Cem. And I'm looking to the audience, because this is a town hall, folks.
Sure.
Put up your hand and come into the conversation. But Cem.
I think it's great that you take the lead and are a model there for other countries. For instance, what my ministry right now does, we have on one side the pressure that we have to rush the increase of renewables. On the other side, land, unfortunately, there's a lot of pressure on land. We need new houses. People from the big towns during the Corona crisis want to move to the countryside. And my farmers need the land. So how can we solve that? So we recently established a program, or initiated a program, agricultural photovoltaic, bring it together. It might bring a new income source for a lot of farmers who need new income sources. So thinking out of the box, I believe, helps us there. But again, let me come back to my point. It's not that we all have won the battles. We're still fighting the battles. In my case, we have the inflation, which makes it much more difficult for all the things the new government has in mind regarding fighting climate change, because if you have rising energy prices, if you have a rising inflation, it's very hard to talk about carbon prices. It's very hard to talk about whether some of the meat prices are really fair prices for the farmers. As you can imagine, it's not something everybody cheers when the minister says we have to rise some of the prices in order to have fair prices for the farmers. So I think we have to analyze correctly what's the source for the rise of the prices. Some people use it to say it's because these crazy guys want to invest into renewables. Renewables are not the reason, they're the solution. We should address the inflation as what it is. It's a fossil-based inflation. It's very important that we make sure this is a fossil inflation, because prices for fossil energy are rising, and that's the reason. So the solution, if we want to lose that question, if you want to solve that question, is go towards renewable much faster as we did it in the last decades, and be less depending on fossil fuels. That has a second, since you mentioned my security side in my previous life, has a second benefit, and that is we're less depending on authoritarian regimes. Because if you look at the map, who are those countries who are the fossil fuel strong countries? Very few of them are democracies.
So since no one is putting up their hand, I'm now going to call on people. And I'm going to go take Munich young leaders first, Ottilia. My friend Ottilia Manganidze from South Africa, I'm sure has something to say on the subject.
Thank you very much, and a special thanks to the panel for this discussion. I've been listening more than thinking that I would be able to contribute or pose a question. But now that you've brought this question around fossil fuels into the debate, and obviously there has been connections around, we can have conversations about food security, but we have to recognize that conversations about food security are as much about human security as they are about climate change as well. Recognizing the contribution of fossil-heavy countries, but also those that are more developed, how can you balance that for those of us in the developing world that still need some reliance on fossil fuels in order to get to where Germany, for example, is?
I think that's a question to you, Cem.
Well, thank you for the question. when the first time my party was in power, between 1998 and 2005, we established a law to attract renewable energies with a kind of a funding system. We were heavily criticized for that because, I have to be fair, it was expensive. But what it led to is that we made renewable energy available for the rest of the world because it lowered the prices. And now, photovoltaic, wind energy has comparable market prices. It's cheaper than a new coal power plant. It's cheaper than nuclear power. Nuclear power, of course, makes sense if money doesn't matter, if security doesn't matter, then of course you can do it. We think a bit different. So renewable energy, because of what we did, now is available in many places of the world. So my answer to your question would be, because we are a rather wealthy country, we have to practice what we preach. We have to prove that you can have high living standards, jobs, social security with a sustainable life. If we preach to others but don't practice it in our country, why should others follow that path? And so the way is not that we say, get rid of your wishes, of your dreams, having high living standards, traveling around the world, and so on. The answer to that is, of course, technology, but at the same time, fair distribution, and for the Western countries, for the richer countries, practice what we preach. Prove in our own countries that we can have an industrial-based country with renewable energy, based on renewable energy, proof that we can have food security based on a agricultural policy that is less depending on pesticides, on poisoning soil and water and so on, being more based on organic farming, having transport which is affordable, comfortable, but at the same time sees the borders of Mother Nature.
Thanks, Cem. So we're sort of, Stefano de Mistura, well known from many years in the UN system. Stefano, please.
Thank you, thank you. I am currently in the UN system. But,
Again.
But I wanted to refer to my Syrian experience when I was UN envoy there. And to the point that the minister raised very effectively about the link between security, in other words, conflict, and hunger. But I wanted to draw the other way around as well. When we were watching this horrible long conflict, which is still going on in Syria, we started discovering that it started somehow, if we want to really analyze some of the origins, apart from the Arab Spring, which was like a trigger, that there was a long drought in Syria. And that long drought produced problems in agriculture. And the way the government handled it was very ineffective. And that produced a movement of the farmers to the cities. The majority of the Syrians are Sunnis, as you know, and the leadership is Alawite. That increased the tensions between jobless people vis-à-vis farmers, vis-à-vis the government people who were mostly military, civil servants, Alawites. That produced even more tension, and when the fire came on the oil, it became a big conflict. So, in other words, sometimes hunger can produce insecurity, as conflict can produce hunger. So paradoxically, the two are a circle which we have to break.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stefan, for bringing us back to the issue of security, because that's what this conference is about. But as we've seen, we have these short-term situations, and David and Cindy spoke to those. They're dramatic, and they need to be addressed in the short term. And so funding needs to be produced from governments and from the private sector, presumably. But we have to look at those long-term, medium and long-term solutions if we want to get a handle on those things. So now let's have a final round with your thoughts. Mariam, you start.
My thoughts. I think we all know the linkage between climate, water security, energy security, food security. It's all inextricably interlinked. And the only thing I can say is we need to work together more. Partnerships is extremely important. Also, me being here, I'm also getting to know also the new government in Germany as well. And we've built also a lot of relationships on the energy side. We've done a lot, and I hope also with His Excellency we'll look on the food systems, what we could do together. And of course, with all the other countries, I think it's so important that we think of partnerships moving forward.
Thanks, Mariam. Bill?
I'd only say that a little bit of a note of optimism. As the Minister said, we know what we need to do. And as Werner and I have been saying, we have the tools to do it. So it's actually, despite the scale and especially the urgency of the challenges that we face, I think we can do this in short order if we just execute on a plan that we know what we need to do. It's just a little bit of technology and a little bit of policy shifts, and we can get this done in short time.
Thanks. That was very optimistic.
Yeah.
Werner?
Yeah, I would quote Cindy McCain, please keep the topic on the agenda. It's of so paramount importance that we discuss what to do. It is so important to form these alliances where people who can make it happen together have trust in each other, start collaborating, see results, and then scale. Yeah, so that would be my pledge.
Okay. Cem?
There's not a lot to add because everything was said. So I agree with everything was said. I mean, fair access to water, fair access to land is crucial. And let's just start it. That's what matters. Let's do it.
Okay, so there's a sustainable development goal, which is number 2, which is about eliminating hunger. And the situation as of right now is we are moving away from meeting that goal rather than approaching it. And that is a driver of insecurity and conflict, and therefore there's a need, an urgent need to think about how we can develop solutions in the medium and long term to do that. So thank you very much for being here. Let's give a hand to the panel. Pleasure.